Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Mage, Errant, Book 6, Tongue Eater. Chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23. It could always be worse. A land bleached clean. Languages of lightning. And ritual magic. In these episodes, we go to another world. We don't touch base with Alustin in this section at all. And guys, this other world is wild. And I'm pretty interested in it. And I just kind of would like to spend more time here, honestly. I would be down to stay. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. Thank you very much to Dan, who is here in the chat, for commissioning this episode. What's up, Dan? This is reminding me of Diane Duane's Young Wizard series. And I think he referenced, like, in the dedications in the very first book, I think he said something about how she was a major influence among another handful of writers. So for those who are not familiar, and I never got to finish the series, it was commissioned, but I only got commissioned up to the last book, and that was where it stopped, which was Agony. I really enjoyed the aspect of her books where you are traveling to different worlds and getting to see the structure of those places. And when I say structure, I mean like the most literal physical structure, because the way places are built is like completely different depending on what the material is and what the atmosphere is and whatever. And there is one universe where everything is coated in silicon, and not silicone, like silicon the element, and that world turns into like sort of a computer being world, which was my personal like favorite, because what a wild idea. And so the native species to that universe are like tiny robots. It's a really, really neat idea. And anyway, these are moments, and no offense to myself, I don't mean it me, but these are moments when I'm reading about these like really dope, unique universes that people come up with that I'm like, why am I going to try and write? I would never come up with something this cool. Why bother? Come on. Who wants to read about a thing that isn't crystal creatures that are the size of houses? Like, no. I'm not going to do it. I'm not writing it. It's stupid. And I really do have to just keep in mind, like, I like lots of books that don't have giant crystal creatures in them. It's fine. That doesn't have to always be what it is. But I'm so blown away when people have this level of creativity where it feels like they're just letting their mind out of a box. And I feel like a prisoner in that box so often that I'm really in awe of the freedom they have coming up with these ideas. And I want that for myself. I want to be unrestricted, you know? And I really struggle with it. I'm a rule follower, and I am a person who really gets like focused on, well, does this really work? Like scientifically? Literally, who cares? It's magic. You could just do it. It's fine. So anyway, I thought this was really neat. And, you know, I was just saying last section, like, the labyrinth wasn't weird enough. And I maintain that he set such a high standard because of the library that the labyrinth isn't as weird, like, in the way that it's formed. The weirdness is mostly the creatures in it. Occasionally, you know, we have the gravitational things and shit that's weird. But mostly it's the creatures. But then I was sort of like, even if you have the weirdness of the library reflected in the labyrinth, is that like cooler? You already have the weirdness in the library. The labyrinth can just be a different type of thing. And the library remains its own specific weird, you know? And I really wasn't like... So it turns out, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it turns out they're not going to this other universe to be in the universe and perform the ritual from there. They are traversing through the universe to get to another labyrinth, and then they will be... And they come out in a second different universe. And all of this is so that they can travel from one spot in Anastis to another, but they're using the labyrinths as sort of shortcuts. And so there's like a series of places that they have to get through. So I was thinking that in order to stretch the bond between him and Kanderon, that going to another world was going to be it. And that we were just going to, you know, the fact that we were literally in a different dimension would be what stretched it. But apparently you've got to be in the same universe because the magic it just functions completely differently, which makes sense, but I just didn't really think about the magic functioning that differently. And I'm not embarrassed by that because that's just like, he's just gone crazy a little bit here. So that's fine. Dan says, I mean, you can do stuff where you go, does this work scientifically? And then you get hard sci-fi like Peter F. Hamilton. Huh, you're right. The other worlds are about stretching. They say that. The other worlds are about stretching? Or the other worlds are about shortcuts? Hold on. I thought I got it, but now I'm not sure. But yeah, this, the does it work scientifically thing, I very much respect when things do, but I've said before how I am not somebody who really cares that much about intricate magical systems. So it's kind of funny that I'll get caught up in that sort of granular detail when it's not even what I enjoy when I'm reading particularly. So it's like I bog myself down in something that I neither care that much about nor enjoy writing or reading that much about. And I could just not do that. And I feel this obligation to do it. And I think that a lot of that obligation comes from, unfortunately, some of the, like, a lot of the fandoms for the more popular sci-fi and fantasy stories are have a huge, they're written by men a lot of the time. Their fan base is mostly men, and the magical system is something that a lot of the people who are fans come to the story for and debate and get really like theoretical about. And I think that I unconsciously am trying to like tap into that sort of fan base because it seems the most legitimate to me due to how these male writers have found success. It's sort of like, well, don't you just want to aim for the same type of audience they have? And I don't know why I think I need to appeal to those types because they're just not going to like the type of thing that I plan to write. So I just got to let a lot go. I have a lot. Doing this job has simultaneously helped with me realizing that there's like potential for me to do a wildly different thing than I planned, but also put me in the position of realizing how good a lot of writers really are, and that I feel completely like incompetent. I was going to say inadequate. That's not even a strong enough word. Incompetent in comparison. So anyway, okay. So let's go to the beginning here. Chapter 20 is titled, It Could Always Be Worse, which, like, don't say that. This is one of those things where I know where you're coming from on saying this, but don't do it. There's three scenarios where you could say it could always be worse. One of them is lots of bad things just happened and you're trying to make yourself feel better. And you say it could always be worse in an effort to minimize what's a very clearly shitty situation. I say, don't say it could always be worse there, because that's the jinx. You don't jinx yourself. Don't do it. Don't say it out loud. You just don't. It's like the same as like, well, what else could go wrong, or nothing could go wrong, or whatever. The second situation is you're saying it could always be worse to make yourself feel, or another person feel, like they don't have a right to complain, which is just like not a great move. Just don't, if somebody's complaining and that's just sort of their pattern, and what, like, maybe that's a different situation. But a lot of times we will be very hard on ourselves and we will be going through a legitimately difficult time, but then we stop and we're just like, I should be more grateful because there are people out there who have it so much worse. Why are you doing that? Is that helping for you to like move through this and work your way to acceptance and kindness? And no, it's just you trying to shut yourself up or shut somebody else up. Don't do it. And the third way it could always be worse is you're pointing at somebody else and their situation and being like, at least I'm not like that, which sucks. So just, it could always be worse. It's like almost never the vibe. Just avoid it. But I do appreciate it here because the context in this situation is like extremely specific. So obviously my 3 scenarios don't match. But so they have to go through to the other world, which is called Apoptis. And it has a totally different deal with like mana and ether and everything, which causes something called ether sickness. And they have this later on again, but it manifests really differently. So here it turns out to be it's a blinding migraine, which honestly, if you've ever had a migraine, this was rough to read. And later it turns into, is it just straight nausea? But there's it manifests differently later, which I thought that was interesting, that even the like ether sickness isn't the same depending on where you're going. And they theorize that because Talia seems to have gotten over it the soonest, that if you've got like multiple reservoirs, maybe that makes it worse for you somehow. And there is so much here about, I'm trying to sort of decide how much detail to go into when covering a lot of the stories from Galvacrin and the information from him, because I think it's very interesting and I want to go over everything, but I feel like I'm probably going to run out of time if I attempt to do that. So I'm going to sort of jump back and forth, and maybe if I wind up with some extra time at the end, I'll come back and like cover some specific details. But there's a whole thing with like the way that the dimensions are layered upon each other. I am not going to get into it. There is somebody just very kindly who came through on the YouTube, because I post these to YouTube, the audio. And I'm just going to credit them real quick. Torridon was trying to explain about the bond between Kanderon and Hugh, and they left this comment on YouTube, which is meant to explain the physics concept behind what it is Hugh is saying. And Torridon, I so appreciate you, but I have got to confess, I didn't get it still. And I'm sure that you're spelling it out in like the most layman's terms way, but I am a dodo bird about some things, and this is just something I have accepted I will not understand. So appreciate the effort, and maybe that comment will help somebody else. But personally, I just have sort of put my hands up and been like, it works because it works. It's fine. I don't need to know. So once they'd eaten breakfast, they set out navigating up the labyrinth. It was trivially easy. They'd emerged only 4 levels deep, and this one is much more shallow. So there's not a lot that's like very dangerous, and it's like got some shifting floor plans with traps and whatnot, but Mackerel's really good at helping them. And it says the only real oddity was the fact that the walls were covered in more of the odd dot patterns instead of spell forms, which I really want to know about that and what that's about. There had been a few nasty monsters Mackerel had detected, notably one that looked like a herd of wolf-headed horses made of toxic mist, yet still a single creature somehow, but the spellbook easily and safely guided them around it. And Talia here is like continuing to be like, this is just really easy, guys. I thought we were doing some shit, and I feel like I'm in just out for a stroll. When is it going to be at the level I prepped for? I've got weapons. I've got spells. I've got this dope armor that's tattooed on my bones. And I'm barely getting to try any of it out. And I just keep wanting to like reach through the book and just slap her. And just, again, it's the jinx. Respect the jinx. Don't, Talia. Stop it. You're just, it's, if you don't believe in the jinx, fine. But if there are other people who are involved in a situation and you decide not to respect the jinx, which could affect your fellow compatriots, that's just very selfish. The only time you get to disrespect the jinx is when it's only about you. So, this is so cool. The first floor was the weirdest of the bunch. The walls and floors covered in slippery tiles that vaguely resembled flattened turtle shells. But the monsters they found weren't particularly dangerous. The worst of the lot was a slithering carpet-like creature the length of a ship, resistant even to Talia's dream fire. It was slow enough, however, that they could escape from it at a slow walking pace, so they didn't even bother fighting it, which I thought was hysterical. Like, I just would be so mad if I were this crazy looking creature, but then I moved extremely slowly. That would just feel really disrespectful. And there's a moment here where Godric says that they're in a lava tube, and that because so much of this feels really familiar, it's not even like they've left Anastis to him. And this is when Hugh pulls out Galvacrin's Guide to World, and Mackerel tries to eat it. Talia dragged him back and promptly started lecturing him. Just like Galvacrin's bestiary, all of them changed and shifted. New entries appeared daily, sometimes on entire worlds and sometimes subsections about various worlds already present. Which I know that this is a book, but I just really like to think about all of this as a blog. And that, like, Galvacrin is out there with his little laptop that he pulls up, and he just updates the entries on the blogs and makes sure that his, like, all of his tags and stuff are organized. So huge sections of the book had been redacted. Hugh could tell the redactions had been done by someone other than Galvacrin, but he had no idea who. All the copies you could access in Kanderon's lair had the same redactions. I'ma say Kanderon did it. And I'm going to hazard a wild guess that those redactions are linked somehow to the dot language that he is seeing around. Do I have anything to support this theory? No, nothing. But the one thing that keeps tripping me up about the situation with Kanderon is the fact that what Alestin accused her of was like making deals with beings in other worlds, and he thought it was so that she could amass power to like run Anastis, and I just don't think that's what she was attempting to do. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of the redacted stuff maybe had to do with whatever it was that she was up to. Because when he confronts her about it right before he attacks her, he doesn't let her explain, and she does not seem ashamed of what he has discovered. It's not like she's sort of, you know, looking abashed and like, no, you don't understand. I know how it looks. But she's just basically like, I'm doing what the fuck I'm doing, and you can mind your own goddamn business. And for me, that reaction felt like Alestin's got the wrong end of the stick on this, which is definitely part of, you know, me feeling like somebody set him up, set everybody up to turn against Kanderon. So I think that might be it, but I'm just guessing. Ooh, good call. Dan says it's Magic Wikipedia. Yeah, that's a good one. Instead of a blog, a magical Wikipedia. That's way better. So let's see. Hugh opened the massive tome to one of the crystal bookmarks he'd placed in and read over the entry for Apoptis one more time. And he reads it like 3-4 times. And then he has to take out all of this stuff to protect himself. Because it turns out that there is like a toxic sort of glittery powder in the air that will fuck your lungs up. And also there is a solar flare that happens like fairly often, and the world has adapted to it and does its own thing to change and protect itself. But if our friends are out in the sun when a flare occurs, they will just vaporize, essentially. So this is very, very dangerous. And the whole energy of this, for me, was very anxiety inducing, because what Hugh tells them is that they need to keep an eye out for the world turning white, which is a clue that everything is transitioning to protection mode because a flare is coming. And the idea of having to be, you're already in an alien world, which is just so strange, and it makes me anxious, just that part. But then that you have to keep an eye out for the world changing color so that you can like hide quickly enough to not get vaporized by the heat. This is a nightmare. This feels like a level in a video game. You know what I mean? So the sun beat down brutally hard on the surface, enough to sunburn an unprotected human in seconds. It was hotter and brighter than Hugh had ever seen, save from the burning power of the eye of Heliothrax. Hugh could feel it beating cruelly at him even through his clothes and warded hat. Talia's scrimshaw ward had turned a deep shimmering red where the sun hit it, protecting her from its glow. And I just, again, really want to see Talia's armor on screen because it sounds crazy. The landscape the sun illuminated was utterly alien. They were on a wide, rolling plain, covered in low-lying plants and bushes, as well as the occasional thick-trunked tree. The plants weren't anything like those on Anastis. Their leaves had jagged, almost fractal edges, were far thicker than normal leaves, and ranged in color from midnight black to a dark blue barely distinguishable from black. All of them glistened almost like glass. And later on, when they try and cut through them, it takes like a lot of effort to get the knife through, and eventually this liquid pours out and all of these little insects come to feed on it, which is, again, how do you come up with this stuff? This is wild. And Talia notices that the mountains are white, and she's like, is that what we need to worry about in terms of the world turning white? And he's like, no, those are fine. It's the plants. That's what we need to keep our eye on. So they set out, and what few insects Hugh saw ran swiftly along the ground with far too many legs, or clung beneath the thickest leaves. There weren't any grasses to be seen, nor any other low-lying ground cover below the knee-high black plants. Many of the broad-leafed plants looked almost like they'd shattered their way through the hard-packed soil of Apoptis. The group carefully circled well away from all the trees. Only some of them were carnivorous, but there was no easy way to tell which of them would try to eat them. And I was just like, word? What? You're going to want to watch out for the trees because they do snack on people. It depends, so just be careful. Oh my God. So they see all of these wild sounding creatures. And this part was the one that really got to me. Black, balloon-like, drifting animals floated just above the plants, each the size of a child's torso. Dozens of slender string-like tendrils dangled down into the plants, keeping the creatures anchored and pulling them slowly across the plain. When the group got close to one, he saw one of the tendrils retract rapidly, carrying an insect up toward one of the half-dozen mouths on the balloon's underbelly. So they're like land jellyfish is the way that I sort of interpret this. And Mackerel, who is having such a good time, he's flying around, he's interacting with these weird creatures, but eventually he wandered a little too close to one of them trees. He let his guard down, and that tree tries to eat Mackerel. And I think maybe Mackerel had thought that because he's not made of flesh like everybody else, the tree perhaps would not care about him. But it seems like either the tree can also eat something like Mackerel, or it just doesn't know, and it'll try whatever comes near it. It feels movement, and that's good enough, you know? So let's see. Thankfully, there wasn't much glittering dust in the air. Galvacrin had admitted not even he knew where it came from. He hadn't explored past the living mountains. He sounded as though he were just too busy to get to it. And Apoptis would have been far safer for all of them if the Stormward's crown was working. Of the worlds they'd mapped out paths through using Galvacrin's guide, Apoptis definitely wouldn't have been the one Hugh would have chosen to cross first if there had been any other good options. So this is when Talia chimes in and is just like, hey, there's some white I'm seeing, and they have to create a shelter. So it's Godric that handles the shelter itself, digging it out of the ground. And it's a really lucky thing, honestly, in some ways, here that the ground is the same kind of stone. It's something, in other words, that Godric can affect. Because later on, they pass a bunch of caves, and he says that his affinity senses, they're not picking up anything from those caves, that they look like regular, but they're not. So it would have been a real bummer if they thought they knew what they were getting into here, and then he tried to create a shelter in the earth, and it turned out there wasn't any way for him to affect it, actually. So he builds the structure. Sabe drew what little moisture from the air and ground she could, building her armor thicker and thicker. As they worked, the landscape's changes accelerating. The floating balloon-like insectivores turned white and deflated, hiding themselves underneath the thick plant life as they sank. The mirror-shelled grazers withdrew fully underneath their shells, and their attendant insect swarms either followed them or retreated under plants. To Hugh's surprise, a whole pack of predators erupted out of the undergrowth, sprinting toward a set of nearby trees. The predators resembled much larger versions of the arrowhead creatures Mackerel had chased, save for the obvious difference of a mouthful of teeth that nearly split their head in half vertically, and a wicked-looking set of hooks near the end of their tails. They started systemically testing nearby trees. One of them would dart in close, then dodge back out at astonishing speed. Within a few moments, the pack had found a trio of safe trees to huddle under during the duration of the flare. As Hugh watched the carnivorous trees fold up their dozens of mouths and talons, he shuddered and decided to stay even farther away from them the rest of the time on Apoptis. And yikes, guys. This is just so incredibly weird. The inhabitants of Apoptis had earned their resistance against their sun's regular flares the hard way. Even in the shade, Hugh and his friends would get cooked alive. So they go down there into the shelter, and Hugh uses a glow crystal, and it's not like his affinity. It's one of those crystals that's got a chemical reaction inside, and that's why it works. So it doesn't require any magic. And I really like this. Sabe converts her armor to mist to fill the shelter with fog to keep them cool. Which, there's something about that detail that I find really fascinating. And it's interesting how, because they're underground, it makes sense, that this would help. But there's always the aspect for me, having been living down here in Texas recently, where to me it's about to get very hot, so I'm going to add humidity to the air. That sounds like a pure nightmare, but I could see how in their particular situation it wouldn't work the way that I think of it working. So Hugh checks himself to see if he's got sunburn. He has a little patch on the back of his neck, and even being mostly underground and having the tiny shelter filled with cooling fog, the temperature rose steadily over the next half hour. It helped a bit when Godric replaced parts of the walls with cooler, less hard-packed earth from deeper down, and even more when Sabe spun up her wind armor to cool them off. But when the flare finally ended an hour later, it was miserably hot inside the tiny shelter. This sounds awful. Oh my god. And they have to do this a few more times. It's like growing easier and easier for them to create the shelter, and they're figuring out ways to make it more, just less miserable inside. But, you know, it's using up a lot of their mana. It's taking a long time every time they've got to take one of these breaks. There was a reason Galvacrin had suggested most travelers attempt a crossing of the plains at night rather than during the day. But night on Apoptis had more than enough horrific dangers of its own. So they had opted to deal with the flares rather than the territorial nocturnal grazers or the predatory auroras. He just says predatory auroras, and then he just moves on. How are you going to drop something like that? What even does that... What? What do you mean? Oh, you guys. I really thought we were going to get a little like, this is what... No. It's just moves to another, like, you know... Oh my god. I can't even imagine. I'm not even going to hazard a guess. So, let's see. Oh, here's the part that I thought was wild. Galvacrin hadn't said what happened. There had been another mountain. They were not made of rock. Tiny coral-like creatures that built up the mountains over many of the labyrinths of Apoptis formed countless millions of fingernail-sized plates which stacked together in great layers atop the labyrinths to form the mountains. Galvacrin hadn't said what happened to this mountain, but its labyrinth and the mana well it guarded were both just gone, as though they'd been torn free of Apoptis. Which I would like to also know more about that. So, this is where Talia points out the caves, and Godric is just like, absolutely not. They're not made of rock, and they all try and use their affinity senses, and nobody is getting anything. And there's a moment here where Hugh and Sabe have a conversation about Hugh's continuing self-loathing due to the fact that his magic isn't working and that he has to rely entirely on his friends here. And I really appreciated this because Hugh is just like, I know that these feelings are not correct, but they just still happen and it sucks. And I thought I would be done with this shit by now. And Sabe has to be like, babes, you can't just like have an epiphany and then suddenly not deal with your shit anymore. It's not like that. You just gotta keep coping and train your whole thought process in a different direction. And that it's perfectly normal for it to take a long time. And this is something that I think that I got fed expectations about growth in general. I mean, growth in terms of like your own thought processes, but also like growth of your abilities and like the concept of training and stuff by montages in movies. I think I absorbed way too much of that because in movies, you know, for the sake of the narrative, you have this moment where the hero is suddenly struck by the realization of what's at stake or what they're really capable of, whatever. And all of a sudden then you get a montage of them just kicking ass and they're like, you know, they're training hard, but they're succeeding and it's a fucking straight line and there's no question that they are going to be able to like take on whatever whoever turns out to be the person that's going up against them or the creature or the obstacle. And I think that I did for a long time really believe that if you have a strong and true enough epiphany, that will spur a complete change. And it's just such horseshit. It's one of those things that if you know, like, there's no way to put this into a movie and not have it kind of be depressing. having an epiphany about yourself and your patterns happens over and over again with the same realization. And what I mean by that is you'll have an epiphany that like, oh, I push people away because I'm afraid of getting hurt because I have abandonment issues. And you'll have that epiphany and you'll be like, yes, that's very true. I can see that. And then like a month later, you will have kind of forgotten about it. And then a year and a half passes and you'll have that whole epiphany all over again. Like it's brand new fucking information. Like you just never thought of it before. When you had a moment the first time you thought that, and you'd think that would really stick, but then it comes up in a different way, coming from a different direction. And so it looks totally new because it's not in reference to the same situation. And then you have to go through, oh my God, I just did it again. It's right there. I just did it again. And it is sobering. There is nothing like getting older to realize you're going to spend your whole life trying to do better and hopefully actually doing better, but probably never escaping it. It's just sobering. That's all I'm saying. So let's see. When they reached the other side of the pass through the split mountain, Hugh had expected just to see more plains, and he hadn't expected to see a herd of a dozen creatures the height of buildings. And these things are made of crystal. There's like a liquid inside that is, you know, part of their system. And I'm thinking of it like blood, of course. And this is so funny. He hastily pulled out the Galvacran's Guide to Worlds, rested it on the ground, and flipped through the pages trying to find a section he'd briefly skimmed when he first found the book. Or at least until Mackerel started trying to eat the guide again. Once Godric and Talia had wrestled his spell book away, while Sabe kept watch on the creatures, Hugh quickly managed to find the section he was looking for. And they're called the Kyrene, and they are friendly. I love the detail that they will like get in between opposing armies and push them apart like they're just parents separating their children who are fighting, but that they do engage in violence amongst themselves. So it's not like they're pacifists. It's just that they, you know, it's one thing if they fight and it's another thing if you assholes fight. Like, come on, don't. It's such a waste of all our time. We're trying to sleep. You're keeping us up. You have school in the morning. And the Kyrene are really durable, really strong in magic. They're basically made of crystallized magic. As we find out later, they're made of ether crystal. And Galvacran's like, if they wanted to take down literally every other world and like rule them, they could. No problem. It would be easy. These things are just pretty much top of the food chain. But they don't want to do that. And that's just lucky for us, pretty much. The Kyrene are largely dismissed in importance by most universal factions or multiversal factions and powers due to their rarity in our worlds. And he's just like, yeah, that's not smart to me. I feel like there's a lot here with the way that they work that we could like learn from and maybe should be afraid of. And to make matters worse, the Kyrene are terribly powerful. Even the least of them are more difficult to kill than a dragon, can tear apart fortress walls with their bare limbs, and often wield magics from multiple alien worlds, usually unlike anything in the known multiverse. And because they're like, they exist across various worlds, his theory is, I think those are all their territory. I think that they just, the way that they approach that is very different from the way we do, and so it doesn't look that way to us. But yeah, they are in charge if they feel like it. Even if the probability of them taking offense against us is low, it isn't absent. We have some evidence of massive, centuries-long, deeply violent wars between different Kyrene factions, ones that devastate entire worlds. Their peace process seems to involve opposing war leaders and generals engaging in one of their suicidal mating rituals, which quite obviously is not a viable option for any other inhabitants of the known multiverse to conduct peace negotiations with them by. As such, I highly recommend that multiversal travelers politely greet all Kyrene they meet and indulge any of their curiosities. So this is what they do. They are just like, all right, let's approach them. And I don't know about y'all, but I kept picturing these guys as like a combo of AT-ATs from Star Wars and elephants. Because when you think just giant, sort of gentle creature, that's elephants. Come on. Then when we start chapter 22, this is wild. Sabe can hear them talking because they're using like electricity as a means of communication, which is something that a lot of animals in Anastis also do. But evidently the way that she can hear it is like when she was a kid and her affinity was first coming in, she was really freaked out by it because all of a sudden it was all of these weird sort of like popping, fizzling sounds and whistles and stuff. And so she had just been like, what is happening? And thankfully, because of the type of ability her family deals with, they recognized what it was pretty quickly. But I just can't imagine if you were like in and amongst people who either don't have a lot of magic like Emblem, or folks who just aren't familiar with a lightning affinity, just what would you think it was, you know? And apparently a lot of the creatures that use this to communicate are underwater creatures. So let's see. There were rumors that something in the ocean spoke true language in lightning, that hidden among the endless crackles and pops of the lightning fish was the language of sentience, that somewhere deep dwelled a civilization that spoke in lightning. But Sabe had never heard it, nor did she know anyone who had. All she'd known listening to the lightning were the crude, mindless crackles of fish talk. The speech of the Kyrene was a grand ocean-crossing ship compared to the leaky dory of fish language. The whistles and pops jumped and slid down past each other like an intricate machine, like a half-dozen songs played at once in the same key. And everybody is just like, Sammy? Girl, you okay? Because she has just zoned out and is very startled by this. I wonder whether Galvacron's aware of the way that they communicate, because you can't hear it if you don't have this affinity sense. And I don't know how many people have run across them that have this specific affinity sense and know this. So it seems to catch her pretty off guard. But yeah, she is just really fascinated by this and attempts later to sort of replicate the sounds they're making toward her and her friends, even though she's not sure of the significance of what she's saying. She's just like, well, let me attempt to repeat what you're saying, because I'm assuming that you're trying to be like friendly and just, you know, get to know us. So I will attempt to convey to you that we aren't here to hurt you or do anything, and we are just, you know, passing through. But yeah, it's a pretty cool like concept for communication. It's interesting that she is such a specific affinity that she can tell what it is, and maybe other people would never know this. And there's a great moment where Hugh is the one who catches on that they're made of ether crystal. They're made of solid magic. And she says, but so is Mackerel, and that's hardly a commendation. Instead of giving her the ornery look she'd been expecting, Hugh's spellbook gave her a hurt, wounded look, then retreated sadly behind Hugh's back. No, wait, I'm sorry. I was just teasing you, Mackerel, Sabe said, feeling awful. I didn't mean to... Mackerel poked back out from behind Hugh's back, an obvious look of amusement on his cover. I love that so much, you guys. I love it. He is fucking with her. How does Hugh's spellbook have like so much more of an attitude than Hugh? So the Kyrene come around and they're looking at them and trying to, see what the deal is with them. Even though the giants were extremely careful with their legs, Sabe couldn't help but eye them nervously. Whenever the edge of a leg brushed against Apoptus's thick black foliage, it sliced through the plants like they weren't even there. She didn't want to see what they'd do to human flesh, which, considering how hard Talia had to push her dagger to get through, that's pretty intimidating. So Talia says hello, but they just look at her, and Hugh is attempting to use his affinity senses to get a read on them a little bit, and Talia is like, using your crystal sense? Isn't that kind of just invasive? And they have an argument for a minute about the taboos around nudity and whether it's the same thing. And then finally Sabe interrupts and is like, I want to try something. So she summons a tiny flicker of lightning between her hands. The crackling sound it made to her ether sense drowned out the speech of the Kyrene for a moment. An instant later, the entire herd of Kyrene went silent and motionless. Godric gave her a nervous look. Sabe, I think you might have... Sabe shook her head at him and listened. One of the Kyrene waved at them, then let out a long, slow, sliding whistle, audible only to Sabe's lightning sense. Sabe smiled and summoned another lightning bolt between her hands. This one was much smaller, but rather than just letting it flash, Sabe kept it going for several seconds as she tried to mimic the whistle. Once she had a crude approximation, she began lowering the intensity of the lightning, trying to mimic the slide. It barely worked, diving off pitch and getting interrupted with crackles and hisses every few heartbeats. But when Sabe finished, the whole herd of Kyrene erupted into loud argument, discussion, and conversation. They barely moved their bodies, but it took most of a minute for the first Kyrene to quiet all the others. Then the immense spider-like giant let out another sliding whistle in lightning speech, followed by 3 evenly spaced crackles. So she goes on doing this for hours. And she's not even certain that she's that she's learned anything. She is attempting to suss out the patterns and stuff, but it's just so tricky, and there are so many elements to this, She's pretty sure she learned the word for rock, given that the series of sounds have been used in reference to both actual rocks and Godric's armor, or maybe the word for hard or dense. Sabe was deeply grateful that her friends let her take the time to talk to the crystal giants. She knew that Hugh was likely especially impatient to get to the next labyrinth. And at one point, they are in the midst of a flare again, and they're like, okay, time to build another one of these shelters. And then all of a sudden, the Kyrene get up and move, and they surround them in a circle and raise their limbs in the air. Those limbs began to fold, bend, and weave together. Within moments, the group was encased in a barn-sized crystal dome of limbs. Mackerel only just managed to dodge back inside one of the last gaps as his new friend finished closing off the dome. Sabe couldn't tell where one Kyrene started and another ended. Their comparatively small bodies were almost impossible to spot with their mouths closed. Then the crystals of the Kyrene bodies darkened. And this is the first time that they get to be out seeing what happens during the flare. So this is really cool. The dome rippled with 1,000 shades of color, like standing inside an opal or a stained glass window. The dome didn't even warm up from the flare. When Sabe pressed her fingers against it, the crystal was cool to the touch, despite the fact that she knew she would die in seconds outside. And then she looks outside, and it looks like there's all these ghosts out there, drifting creatures that looked almost like the children of a manta ray and a jellyfish. They descended from the sky after the land had turned fully white and the flare had grown powerful enough to kill, and they roamed freely outside the dome. They were clearly material beings, unlike the predatory auroras. Again. Really? Come on, man. Sabe saw them brushing aside white leaves as they drifted about. She couldn't begin to guess what they were made of, what they ate, or anything else about them, but they were beautiful. Judging by the sounds of the Kyrene conversation and the colors shifting through their limbs, she suspected the crystal giants thought likewise. So this is just a really neat moment of getting to see. I'm thinking, of course, everything hunkers down and there's nothing living out when there's a flare. But it turns out there's a whole other ecosystem that comes into play when there is a flare, and then that goes away, which is that's just a compelling thought, you know? So there's a final goodbye where she uses her, lightning to imitate them, and she feels like she gets some approval off of them. And then we go to chapter 23. Hugh led the others toward their destination, though even he struggled to focus his attention on their route instead of on thoughts of the giant crystal beings. And let's see. Despite the number of labyrinths scattered across the plain, Galvacrin had noted that Apoptis was far from going ether-critical and developing demons, which was for the best. That would turn it from merely a horrifying death world that was convenient for multiversal travelers into something utterly impassable. Given that more than half of the potential routes he had mapped out to get to Highvale via the labyrinths passed through Apoptis, it would have been more than a minor inconvenience to avoid it. Ooh, I'm so sorry. I'm just seeing that there's a bunch of chat here. MX Shard is in here. I'm doing the thing I figured out about myself that I want to stop doing. Stop doing that, me. Stop. Why aren't you stopping me? Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep. I was picturing those high school biology textbook drawings of viruses with the spidery legs, tall, thin body, and polyhedron head. Wow, I don't know what you are talking about, but I don't want to think about it. So take that back. Just for me. Thank you. Affinity senses are really interesting. I wonder how they might interact with sensory conditions like synesthesia. I have to imagine that would give way to a particular type of, you know what I mean? Like, because the fact that you can't use magic if you can't picture things in your mind, I feel like something like synesthesia would make it like have very specific effects on your magic. So Dan, aliens that are actually alien, not just forehead ridges. Yeah, I get it. We have to have human actors, so we gotta do what we gotta do. But there does, it can be kind of boring. Emic Shard says, to be fair, the Kyrene would play merry hell with a special effects budget. Oh my god. That was what I kept thinking here, actually, was how, if I were to see this on screen, it would just be CGI wall to wall. And it would be like Avatar, look, CGI has definitely got its place, but it has become we are relying on it both because it's simpler and there's more possibilities when you just render it and you don't have to build anything, and also because we are abusing CGI artists and whatnot and just forcing them to work insane hours to make a product, so it's cheaper, but it shouldn't be. And I would love to see some world like this where they built the world, where there's actual thick glass leaves that had been created and made into individual plants that they're walking through. And is that a bonkers level of production that would cost $1 billion? Yes, it is. But the difference when you see things like that on screen versus the CGI is so palpable that it makes me think of sort of Lord of the Rings and, the way that Peter Jackson got so intense about building the props, every single little thing was created for the universe, and it feels that way when you watch it, and I don't think that's an accident, and I also don't think it's a coincidence that The Hobbit just seemed so much more shitty in comparison. So it's a sort of thing where I feel like even though it would be a massive investment, the return on how it would come over to an audience, how it would affect us watching, would be worth it. And I don't know, like it of course depends on a lot of other factors as well. But I would be really interested to see this done practically and without just CGI. If you want to add a little here and there, maybe you build like one sort of field and then you use CGI to expand that field into the distance, fine. But I want to see the creatures actually interact. I just want... Puppets are falling by the wayside, and those are also something that we could utilize for things like this, and we just don't do that very much anymore, and I think it's such a shame. CGI feels like salt to me if cinema was cooking, says MX Shard, and I think that's a good, like, CGI should be used to, for me, it's sort of like polish, you do your build, you make your thing, and you put it all together, and then you give it one last coat to shine everything up. And you don't rely on the shine coat to be the product, because that's weird and looks weird. Dan says, anime, most of the high fantasy series would have to be animated to do them justice. Yeah, and that, like, nothing against animation, because some animation can be truly astonishing. And I want to point, of course, to, the Spider-Verse, but they really pushed those animators so hard that I hesitate to use that as a metric, because while it looked utterly incredible, those people really got taken advantage of. So I just hate referencing that. But like, if you've seen it, I mean, that's art. I mean, it's beyond belief what they managed to pull off in that movie. So I know it's possible and can be done really well. But there is something about the practical effect of it being in what seems like our world that I would really just like to see. It just, yeah. So anyway, they have a cave destination, and you guys, they're heading up there, and they run into a possum, and I am here for this joke. I am loving even here. Sabe is like, maybe it just came out through the labyrinth and like followed us, and then another possum comes out. So it's just like this incredibly inhospitable landscape. Possums are still fine. They're just surviving. It's no big deal. And I said already that I stand possums because like, they're like spiders for me. They eat insects. Spiders eat insects. I hate insects. We're on the same side. So the fact that we've got giant crystal spiders and possums here, I feel like I'd be all right. This is a world with things that I'm like, yeah, we could bond. This is cool. So they get into the cave, and it stinks really bad, and it's sort of like a waste disposal. I really like to think of it that they've gone into the mountains, essentially. And then they get to the labyrinth and descend into it. The first level appeared to be fashioned out of the hard-baked clay of Apoptis' surface, filled with the strange dot patterns. Hugh spent a lot of time staring at them, wondering what the magic of Apoptis was like, but not even Galvacrin had any clue. No one had stayed long enough on the world to find out. And I'm real curious about that. Because I don't know. But the fact that Kanderon has those crystal wings, like, is there a link with her and the magic here? Like, I don't know if that's even possible. I don't know anything. So they get down to the second floor. Labyrinth stones were supposed to help guide you through labyrinths, but the ease at which Mackerel did so surpassed any record or description of the process Hugh had found. Even Galvacrin seemed to think of them as merely useful, not essential. And Mackerel is just, if he ever got a true sense of how unique and special he is, I don't think you'd be able to manage him. It would just be impossible. So they finally get to the bottom floor. There they did have to fight again and again as various monsters leapt out of the watery walls and tried to drag them underwater. And that sounds like a true nightmare. Their foes ranged from carnivorous fish to giant eels, but the worst of the lot was a massive, free-moving tumor that dragged Talia into its maw. It couldn't chew through her scrimshaw ward, and she destroyed it from within using Dreamfire easily, but Hugh suspected all of them would need her to use Dreamfire on the nightmares they'd had about this disgusting entity, which really says something because they run into crazy, awful shit so much that if this feels like it's going to make a particular impression, it must be uniquely terrible. So he's struggling again with feeling like they need to watch his back and protect him and, the usual. Their exit to the next world on their trip was only a short jaunt through the obsidian and light maze, and they easily passed through from the 7th floor of Apoptis' labyrinth to the metal honeycomb 6th floor of Kemetria's labyrinth. The dot pattern of Apoptis faded into immense changed scripts of... They looked almost like spell forms, but there were only a few dozen different ones, and they were chained together in clusters almost, but not quite like language. So, they have another hit of ether sickness. And, Hugh has muscle aches and feeling like feverish and rashes. I was thinking it was nausea, but no. Which, that sounds god-awful too. Migraines are its own... That's like... I would not wish migraines on almost anybody. Almost. But muscle weakness and that feeling of like being oversensitive, like when you have the flu. Ugh. Really awful feeling. Really awful. Blah, blah. So... Let's see. Hugh couldn't make head or tails of the sensations coming through his bond with his spellbook, save for the fact that he was definitely suffering too. After spending a few hours recovering, they decided to simply spend the night there. None of them were quite sure how long they'd been awake, and they were all exhausted from their trip so far. And yeah, that was what I was thinking at this point, just like, also, there had been no mention of them stopping to eat, and I'm like, we know that at least Sabe stayed and tried to talk to those creatures for hours. And every time that they got hit with a solar flare on their way before they met those things, that was an hour. So it's been a while. And you guys know I am somebody who is preoccupied with food. And I just kept being like, are you guys going to eat? Are you guys going to take a break and eat anything? What are you doing? The 8th floor of the Kemetrian labyrinth, after the insanity of the previous floors, was perfect. Sure, it had dozens of bull-sized, acid-spitting, wingless, quadrupedal birds nesting in its halls. And sure, there were hundreds of aggressive stone statues like they'd fought in their first labyrinth trip, but it would work. And I was just like, what? That's perfect? Really? That doesn't sound okay. I believe you, but I do have questions. So here it is. Let's see. Godric creating shelters, noodle-thin, heavily warded, corkscrewing tunnels for air connected them to the rest of the labyrinth. And I was just like, I'm so glad that you guys had this figured out, because can you imagine how easy it would have been for them all to die? Like, if you come in here without the necessary information, or if you have a friend who doesn't study quite as hard as Hugh does, they're all really lucky that he does his due diligence. Hugh made sure to double and triple check every single line of the ward spell forms. The next set took hours to build. And it's because of the difference in magic here that Hugh has to adjust everything he knows for the way that mana flows in this universe. And it also, combined with the fact that his magic isn't quite working right, just takes him a long time to get it right. But eventually they manage it. Hugh used chalk to trace a horrendously complex spell form in the center of the little fortified room. It was a close relative of Ward's, but the difference had stretched Hugh's understanding of spell form construction. He doubted anyone without his background in both fields could have created something like this. And these are the things that I want everybody to stop and be like, see, Hugh? Yeah, we need to protect you, but also you just did that. So You know, we all have our things. It was time to save Kanderon. Hugh looked up at his friends. Mackerel was quietly napping in one corner. Sabé was reading Davrigan's census for what must have been the 100th time. Godric was staring at his father's still unread letter folded up in his hands. Talia was just staring at Hugh, watching him work. Is it time? Hugh nodded. Who's ready to save Kanderon? And I adore this moment. Godric's like, hey, I see you opening your mouth to talk, and it looks like your kind of posture has changed in the way that it does when people are about to make a big speech and stuff. And I just want to be sure that you're not about to be like, I know that you traveled through multiple universes and that we have faced all kinds of foes and demons and stuff, but are you sure you want to help me? Because, dude, fuck's sake. I'm pretty sure we've established that we want to be here. So can we just get to it? And I loved it because Hugh is just like, I wasn't gonna. He was gonna. Like, oh, it's so funny. So let's see. They'd argued a lot about whether to include Mackerel and Godric's armor elemental into the ritual, but ultimately they decided the risks outweighed the benefits, as impressive as the latter might have been. And that was really interesting to me. Like, why would it have been impressive? Is it just the technicality of it? And Mackerel seems a bit resentful that he's not being included in stuff. But, yeah. Hugh puts an ether crystal in the center of the spell form and reaches for his mana, and it takes a minute. He has to try a bunch of times. And eventually, he gets a hold of it, and it says, the instant the lines in his quadrant of the spell form began to light up, each of his friends followed suit and began pumping mana into the Warlock Pact. And that's the end of the chapter. So I am super curious. I really have no prediction on how this is going to go. And I want it to work. But at the same time, the fact that it's been sort of lampshaded that this is super dangerous, but we know it's going to work anyway. I'm sort of wondering if he's going to like juke to the left. So I guess we'll have to see. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. Appreciate you all. And yeah, I'll be seeing you on Tuesday with a new set of chapters. So until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.